Welcome to the only daily podcast focusing on compliance news of the day. Each morning, start your day with a cup of coffee and Tom Fox, the voice of compliance, to hear about 4 of the top compliance, corruption, or leadership stories you will need to start your day. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
June 25, 2020, the IMF edition. No, that's not the Impossible Missions Force. That's the International Monetary Fund. And first up, we have a story from the National Law Review that strides in anti-corruption efforts are rewarding in the Ukraine. The IMF has approved a multi-billion-dollar lending program from the Ukraine. The loan was made in part because Ukraine has been successful in passing anti-corruption measures that will ensure the money goes to help Ukraine's struggling economy and government, not to line the pockets of government officials, private businesses like the associates of Donald Trump. Last month, Ukraine passed a bill preventing the use of foreign aid and bank bailouts, prohibits states from returning nationalized banks to private owners, and a series of other stances that were effectively conditions the IMF needed to issue the first disbursement of much-needed funds to Ukraine. And last year, Ukraine passed a new whistleblower law, which would help protect the dispersal of such aid from fraud, as the law protects whistleblowers who believe that the aid was not properly used. Next up, from TheGuardian, reports that the South African police have made arrests over one of the country's most notorious bank corruption scandals. A number of people have been arrested around the looting and collapse of the bank VBS Mutual. VBS held the savings of many disadvantaged people in local municipalities. It collapsed in 2018 with over $100 million in debts. Much of the money had been siphoned into private bank accounts and spent on property, luxury cars, and other types of goods by the people who looted the bank. 4 people were obtained in early morning raids, with further arrests anticipated. The National Prosecuting Authority of South Africa described the VBS scandal as probably the biggest bank robbery in the country, and the arrests constitute one of the first significant operations against corruption in South Africa since President Ramaphosa gained power more than 2 years ago. We follow with a very interesting story from the BBC about the Zimbabwe Anti-Corruption Commission and people who it's started investigations of people who have unexplained wealth. So the authorities say people who cannot explain where their wealth came from are in danger of having their assets seized, even if courts clear them of corruption. This is a step further than the unexplained wealth orders in the United States, as Zimbabwe is facing its worst economic crisis in more than a decade, and there is mounting public anger over both poor services and corruption. The intensive lifestyle audit on some of these rich people will no doubt turn up monies, whether it was from corruption or not. They will have to be able to justify the source of their wealth. And finally, back to the IMF. In a report from First Timer on the Daily Compliance News, the Middle East Eye, the IMF is urged to delay a $5.2 billion loan to Egypt over corruption risks. 8 NGOs say the company's poor governance record could jeopardize funds provided to help its COVID-19 efforts. The IMF agreed with the Egyptian government back earlier this month to release funds, but now NGOs are raising a red flag around the governance in Egypt on this issue. The Daily Compliance News is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network and a proud member of C-Suite Radio. Thanks so much for listening. I hope you'll join me again tomorrow.